A lone rider leaned low in his saddle, broad shoulders hunched against the storm, his hat pulled down tight, his coat stiff with frost. The horse beneath him, a rangy bay, pushed forward step by stubborn step, each breath steaming into the frozen air. The man said nothing, his face set in the kind of silence that knew weather could not be argued with, only endured. He had been out longer than he liked, caught searching for strayed cattle when the storm rolled sudden off the high country. Now all he thought of was reaching the black shape of his cabin tucked along the pines before darkness sealed him into the white void. Yet even as the storm howled, something else carried through it, a sound that was not the wind, not the cry of wolf or the groan of shifting timber. It was thinner, more fragile, almost snatched away before it reached him. A cry, faint and desperate, no louder than a swallow's call. He reined in hard, the bay tossing its head, snorting against the sting of ice. He held his breath. There it was again, closer now, a voice threaded with pain and fear. He turned his horse toward the sound, squinting through the snow that drove into his eyes. The plain looked empty, a colorless sea, until the storm bent for a heartbeat and revealed a huddled shape near a cluster of half-buried rocks. The cowboy pressed his heels to the bay and rode closer, every instinct warning him of how fragile minutes could be in such weather. What he found struck him with a force he did not show on his face. A woman knelt in the snow, her thin body half collapsed, arms wrapped around a bundle of rags. Her skin was pale under the storm's bite, dark hair plastered wet against her cheeks, lips cracked blue. She was Chinese, her features delicate, her eyes squeezed shut against the wind as though she could will herself to shield the thing she carried. The bundle stirred weakly, and from it came the soft, broken mewl of a baby not far from death's reach. The man swung down from his horse, boots sinking deep, and moved to them. His shadow loomed tall against the snowlight. The woman flinched at his nearness, clutching the bundle tighter as though he had come to take it. "It's not my baby," she gasped, her voice rough and broken, trembling through accented words. "I found him in snow, dying." Her eyes, black, wide, full of terror, searched his face as if pleading with him to believe. He stared at her, snow caking his beard, breath slow and heavy. He had questions, many, but the wind answered none of them, and the child's frail cry was fading even as they knelt there. Whatever truth lay in her words, one thing was clear: if they stayed in this storm, there would be no tomorrow for either of them. Without speaking, he pried at her arms gently. She resisted, weak but desperate, until his eyes caught hers with a steadiness that promised neither cruelty nor deceit. Then her grip slackened, and she let him draw back the edge of the rag bundle. The sight hollowed his chest, an infant, no more than weeks old, lips gray, body stiffening. The man swore under his breath, a rare sound from him. He tucked the bundle inside his own coat, close to his heat. The woman sagged sideways, half-conscious now, her body shaking with exhaustion. He caught her before she slid into the snow, lifting her up as if she weighed no more than a sack of corn. She clutched weakly at his sleeve, whispering in a language he did not understand, but the tone was clear, fear mixed with hope, a prayer carried into the storm. He hauled her onto the horse, set the bundle against her chest, and mounted behind, his arms braced around them both. With a shout into the storm, he urged the bay forward. The animal plunged through the drifts, nostrils wide, hooves muffled in the endless white. The world shrank to the circle of his breath and the shape of the cabin he pictured in his mind. He felt the woman's body lolling against him, heard the child's whimper struggle to rise. He pressed them tighter against his chest, his own warmth the only shield he could give. The wind screamed across the land, but the cowboy's jaw locked firm, and he drove the horse on with the grim patience of a man who had seen worse winters and knew how to outlast them. At last, through the blur of snow and night, the black line of pines appeared, their tops bending under weight of ice. And there, crouched among them, the low cabin of rough-hewn logs. Smoke no longer rose from its chimney. The fire had gone out while he searched the ridges. But it stood, and it was shelter. He pulled the horse hard to the porch, swung down with the woman in his arms, and kicked open the door. Cold darkness rushed out to meet them. He set her down on the bed of hides near the hearth, stripped off his gloves, and yanked kindling into the firebox. With practiced speed, he struck flint, sparked tinder, and coaxed flame into life. Light bloomed across the room, flickering on wood walls, catching the sheen of frost that clung to his coat. The baby whimpered again, a sound thin as paper tearing. He crouched, drew the bundle close to the fire's newborn warmth, and peeled back the wet rags. He found a scrap of cloth, dry, and wrapped the child again, tighter. Then he poured water from his kettle, his hands clumsy with urgency, warming milk he kept for emergencies. He touched the spoon to the child's lips, willing it to swallow. A drop slid in. Then another. The baby stirred, weak but stubborn, a spark refusing to die. Behind him, the woman shifted, pulling herself upright on shaking arms. She had one leg stiff and wrapped poorly beneath her skirts, an old injury that forced her weight onto the other. Her eyes, luminous in the firelight, fixed on the baby with an intensity that belied her words of denial. She reached out as though to cradle the child again, then hesitated, her hand hovering midair. The man studied her. Her face carried exhaustion carved deep, yet also a will that had survived things he could only guess. The scars on her knuckles, the thinness of her frame, spoke of hard labor and hunger. But her gaze, softened now with a kind of fear and reverence for the fragile life before them, was what struck him most. He did not speak much. Words, in his world, were wasted unless they mattered. So he said nothing, only shifted the baby closer to her and nodded once. She drew the child into her arms, and as she did, a sound slipped from her throat, not words, but a low, broken hum, a lullaby carried from another shore. The cowboy set about stripping his coat, hanging it by the fire to steam, then stoking more wood until the cabin glowed. He moved with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to solitude, but every so often, his eyes slid back to the woman and the child, as if he needed to assure himself they still breathed. She looked up at him suddenly, her lips trembling. "Not my baby," she whispered again, almost to herself, as if saying it made it true. Yet her hands, delicate despite their scars, held the child with the surety of a mother who could not let go. The man poured coffee into a tin cup, its steam curling into the lamplight, and placed it beside her. He didn't argue her claim. The truth of how the baby came to her arms could wait until daylight. What mattered now was that all three of them were alive. Barely. The wind roared outside, battering the shutters, but inside the cabin the fire's warmth began to seep into their bones. The baby quieted, eyes fluttering shut, its tiny chest rising with shallow but steadier breaths. The woman bent her face to the child's forehead, eyes closing as though offering thanks. The cowboy stood at the window, staring out at the snow-thick night. His reflection in the glass showed a man marked by weather and loneliness, yet tonight that reflection had shifted. Now it carried two shadows behind him. He felt it, though he did not say it, the weight of responsibility pressing into his shoulders heavier than the storm itself. Behind him, the woman's voice broke the silence, soft and unsteady. She murmured something in Chinese, words he could not grasp, but the sound of them carried both pleading and warning. When he turned, her hand caught his sleeve, her grip surprisingly strong despite her weakness. Her eyes shone wide and fearful in the flicker of firelight, as if she saw dangers that had not yet breached the door. The cowboy met her gaze, his silence a kind of vow. Outside, the wind clawed at the cabin like a beast, and somewhere in that distance a wolf's howl rose, long and low, threading through the storm. The baby stirred, whimpering against her chest. The woman's breath hitched, and her fingers dug deeper into his sleeve, as though anchoring herself to him. The fire snapped, throwing sparks into the dark, and the man laid his other hand over hers, steady, grounding. But her whisper came again, shivering through the air, carrying words he could understand this time. "They will come." The fire held through the night, though it burned low and sullen by the time the gray light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the shutters. The storm outside had not broken. The world remained wrapped in a heavy quilt of snow, the silence between gusts so deep it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the warmth was fragile but stubborn, like a flame cupped against the dark. He woke first, as he always did, his body conditioned to rise before the day. The woman lay where he had set her, half turned toward the fire. Her hair spilled across the blanket in a tangle of black strands. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, but her face had softened in sleep, the pinched lines of pain released for the first time since he had found her. The baby was nestled against her, swaddled in the dry cloth he had wrapped it in, its tiny mouth slack in slumber, the faintest fog of breath rising with each exhale. He eased himself to his feet, the boards groaning faintly under his weight, and added more wood to the fire. The flames brightened, chasing shadows from the corners. Then he poured water into the kettle, set it over the iron, and leaned on the table, gazing at the two strangers now occupying his home. The woman stirred when the kettle began to whisper, her lashes fluttering open. For a moment, she seemed unsure of where she was, her eyes darting to the log walls, the narrow window, and finally to him. She pushed herself upright, awkward on her elbows, and winced as her injured leg refused to follow. Her gaze dropped to the baby still tucked against her chest, and she sighed as though relief itself could break her apart. He poured coffee into a tin cup and set it down on the table beside her. She hesitated before reaching for it, her fingers trembling as they curled around the handle. The steam warmed her face, bringing faint color back to her cheeks. She sipped, coughed once at the bitterness, then managed a grateful nod in his direction. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of fire and the baby's tiny noises. He ate a heel of bread left from the day before, tearing it with his hands, and set a piece in front of her. She accepted it carefully, as if she were not certain she had the right. "You eat," he said, his voice low, gravel roughened by the cold and long silence. She looked at him quickly, surprised to hear him speak. Her English was fractured, but she understood. She nodded once and chewed slowly, each bite deliberate, as if her body had forgotten what it meant to take food without fear. The baby stirred, fussing softly. She shifted the bundle, awkward but determined, and began to hum under her breath, a tune without words, lilting and strange, drifting through the room like smoke. He froze at the sound, the bread halfway to his mouth, listening. There was sorrow in that melody, but also something tender, a strength buried beneath grief. It pulled at something in him he had kept buried beneath years of solitude, the ache of an emptiness he had stopped naming. When the child quieted again, she caught him watching and fell silent, her face shadowed with embarrassment. She looked down quickly, as if afraid she had done something wrong. He returned to eating, his expression unchanged, though his ears still carried the tune long after it faded. The morning passed in small tasks. He chopped wood under the lean-to while snow swirled in the yard, his axe striking with a rhythm steady as a heartbeat. She tried to stand, bracing on the rough crutch he kept by the door for mending work, but her leg faltered, and she nearly dropped the baby. She sank back with a quiet cry, clutching the child close, her shoulders trembling. When he came back inside, sweat steaming from his collar, he saw her sitting there with her head bowed. Without a word, he crossed the room, lifted the kettle, and poured her more hot water. She whispered something in her language, soft and heavy with shame. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the way she couldn't meet his eyes. "You keep still," he said, setting the cup within her reach. "Leg needs rest." Her gaze flicked up to his, and for the first time he saw defiance there, a flare of pride quick and sharp. She didn't want to be weak, didn't want to be a burden. He respected that, though he did not say it. He only nodded once, as if sealing the matter, then went about his chores. By afternoon, the storm had eased enough to show the ridgeline through the window, still bleak, but clearer now, the sky a hard pale blue. Inside, the cabin had grown warmer, the air fragrant with beans simmering over the fire. She sat near the hearth, the child asleep in her arms, her eyes following his movements as he worked. She spoke suddenly, her words halting. "You cowboy." He looked up, surprised she had broken the silence. "I am." "You live alone?" she asked, her accent softening the edges of each word. He gave a small nod. "For some years now." She pressed her lips together and lowered her eyes again. He thought that was all, but after a long pause she added, "Alone, hard." He studied her, the firelight flickering across her face. She was right. Alone was hard. But it was safer, too. Safer than risking trust, than letting someone close enough to wound you deeper than any bullet. He didn't answer, but she seemed to understand his silence, as though she had lived inside it herself. That evening, after supper, he brought out a jar of milk he kept sealed in the cool corner of the cellar. He poured it carefully into a tin cup and warmed it over the fire. The baby stirred at the smell, whimpering. He crouched close, dipped a clean rag into the milk, and pressed it gently to the child's lips. The baby latched weakly, swallowing. The woman's eyes widened at the sight. This rough man, scarred and weathered, bent tender over a child not his own. Something in her expression softened, though she quickly masked it. Still, when he passed the child back to her, her hands lingered a second against his, warmth meeting warmth. Night came heavy again, the cabin wrapped in its own cocoon of light while the wilderness pressed close. The baby slept sound, his tiny chest rising steadily now. She sat awake longer, humming her lullaby once more, the notes weaving into the wood smoke air. He lay on his bedroll by the far wall, hat tipped low, eyes closed. But he was listening, every note carving into the silence between them. Hours passed. The fire sank low. She thought he had drifted to sleep when suddenly his voice broke the quiet, steady and low. "You say it not your baby." Her breath caught. The words hung heavy in the room. "Yes," she whispered. "Not mine. I find." Her English was broken, but the conviction in her tone was clear. She stroked the child's cheek with her thumb, her face torn between truth and longing. He didn't challenge her. He only said, "You hold him like yours." She flinched at that, as if he had struck the most tender part of her. Her eyes filled, but she forced them away, staring hard into the embers. Her jaw worked, trying to form words that never came. Silence followed, but not the old silence of strangers. This one was heavier, charged, thick with questions neither of them yet dared to ask. Outside, a wolf's howl rolled long across the night, closer than before. The baby stirred in his sleep, whimpering, and she tightened her hold. He rose quietly, crossed to the window, and peered into the dark. The snow was falling again, slower now, drifting like ash from an unseen fire. He set his rifle by the door before returning to the fire. She watched the gesture, her eyes wide, her breath quickening. For the first time, he saw not just fear in her face but recognition, as if she knew the danger was not only wolves. As if she had been hunted before. She clutched the baby tighter, rocking slowly on the bed of hides. The words slipped from her lips, fragile but heavy with meaning. They not stop. They find. The cowboy stood still, the firelight shadowing the hard lines of his face. His silence was not confusion now, but calculation, the slow turning of a man who measured truth before he spoke. The snow hissed against the shutters, and the night held its breath. When he finally answered, his voice was steady, a promise made of stone. "Then they'll find you here. And they'll find me waiting." Snow lingered across the plains like a burial shroud, unbroken except for the narrow path the cowboy had cut each morning to tend his horses and check his traps. Days slid into one another, marked only by the fire's rise and fall and the quiet rhythms of survival. Inside the cabin, silence held dominion, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was shared now, layered with the soft breathing of the infant, the faint shuffle of the woman's careful steps on her crutch, the low scrape of his boots against the boards as he moved about his work. She said little, but he began to piece her story together not from words, but from fragments. Pauses too long, glances too sharp, scars etched where they did not belong. The questions weighed on him, but he pressed none. Instead, he allowed silence to do its work, offering her the small mercies of food, warmth, and the steady patience of a man accustomed to waiting out storms. One evening, while he sharpened his knife by the fire, she spoke, her voice barely above the hiss of steel on stone. "I come long way." He set the blade aside, the sound of it stopping as if to make room for her. She did not look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on the infant asleep against her chest, her hand rocking gently in rhythm with the flames. "My people," she said slowly, the words caught between her tongue and her shame. "Sold, promised gold, promised better life. Not true. Work, no pay. Hurt." She touched the edge of her jaw where a faint scar curved like a white thread. "They call me dog. They call me less than woman." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on, each word scraped raw. The cowboy's jaw tightened, though he said nothing. He had seen cruelty on the frontier, men who measured worth by skin or accent, who thought themselves kings over lives they'd bought cheap. But hearing it fall in her halting voice struck deeper than any rumor. She smoothed the child's blanket, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Baby, not mine. Men drink, fight, one woman. She hide him in snow. They laugh. Say, let wolves take. I could not leave. Her breath trembled, but she forced the words out, her English bending under the weight of her memories. I run. I take him. They follow. The knife in his hand glinted once in the fire before he laid it down on the table. He leaned forward, his elbows braced on his knees, his eyes fixed on her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "And if they find you?" Her hand clenched over the infant, knuckles white. They kill. Him, me. Both. The words hung heavy between them, thick as smoke. He had lived by simple codes. A man protects his own, honors his word, stands against cruelty where he finds it. Yet these two were not his own, not by blood, not by bond. And still, the thought of giving them back to the storm, or to men who would use them as kindling for their own hate, twisted something deep inside him. The days that followed turned watchful. He began to make small changes, repairs to the doorframe, a second layer of planks against the shutters, extra wood stacked high beside the hearth. His hands moved steady, but his eyes drifted often to the ridge above the valley, scanning the white emptiness for signs of movement. The woman noticed. She always noticed. Her silence carried understanding, though she did not speak it. Instead, she found her own small ways of giving back, patching torn cloth with careful stitches, tending the fire when his work took him outside, humming those soft tunes to the child so the cabin no longer felt like an empty box echoing with wind. The infant grew stronger, his cries sharper, his eyes more alert. Once, the cowboy came in from splitting wood to find the woman laughing. Quiet, broken laughter, but laughter nonetheless, as the baby clutched her finger in his tiny hand. The sound startled him. It seemed foreign, like sunlight in winter. But it warmed him too, spreading through the cabin in a way even the fire could not. One afternoon, a knock broke the fragile rhythm. It was not the storm's hand this time, but a fist, solid, deliberate, against the cabin door. The woman froze, clutching the child so tight he whimpered. The cowboy stood, rifle already in hand, before the second knock fell. When he opened the door, a figure hunched against the cold entered, a trapper he knew from town, beard stiff with ice, eyes restless. The man stamped snow from his boots and glanced around the room, his gaze pausing on the woman and child before sliding back to the cowboy. "You hear the talk?" the trapper asked, voice pitched low. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "What talk?" "Group of riders been asking after a China woman. Said she run off with something that ain't hers. Folks say they been tearing through settlements, waving coin and threats alike." The trapper's glance flicked toward the woman again, sharper this time. "Reckon I found who they're after." The cowboy stepped forward, his presence filling the space between them. "Reckon you'll forget it." His voice was quiet, but it carried steel. The trapper shifted, uneasy under the weight of that gaze. He muttered something, adjusted his pack, and left without further words. The door shut behind him, sealing the cabin back into silence. The woman's breathing was ragged. She rocked the baby, her lips pressed to his crown, her eyes wide with remembered terror. "They come," she whispered. "Soon." He crossed the room, crouched in front of her until she met his eyes. "They'll come," he agreed. His tone was not reassurance. It was fact, accepted like weather. But then he added, slow and steady, "And I'll be here when they do." Her eyes flooded, though no tears fell. She only nodded, once, sharp, as if binding herself to that promise. The following days were heavy with preparation. He set traps around the edge of the property, paths only he knew how to walk. He oiled his rifle, checked his Colt, and stacked ammunition in reach of the windows. She watched, silent but resolute, as though she too understood the language of defense. In the quiet hours, their bond deepened in ways words could not touch. She began to trust the rhythm of his presence, the way he rose with the dawn, the way his silence was not absence but steadiness. He began to trust the softness she carried, the way her lullabies filled cracks in the air he had thought permanent. The child became the bridge between them, binding their lives with each fragile breath. Yet danger pressed closer. Tracks appeared on the far ridge, horses moving where no wild herd would linger. Smoke rose faint from the valley below, curling like a warning. One night, as the storm lulled and the moon shone pale through the thin clouds, she confessed more. Her voice shook, but she forced each word into the space between them. They say, woman like me, not worth saving. No family, no name. But I cannot leave him. I rather die. She bent her head over the baby, pressing her lips to his forehead. He studied her, the firelight carving the hollow of his cheeks, the scars at his temple. Slowly, he reached across the space and touched the baby's small hand, rough fingers brushing soft skin. From now, he said, voice low, steady, it's our baby, and you both got a home here. Her breath broke on a sob she swallowed down, her eyes filling in silence. She nodded once, and for the first time she leaned against him, the child cradled between them, the three of them bound together not by blood, but by choice. The next morning brought no mercy. Across the ridge, dark figures appeared, riders, 5 at least, their outlines stark against the snow. Their horses picked carefully along the frozen slope, the men cloaked and armed. Sunlight struck steel at their hips. The cowboy stood at the window, rifle in hand. Behind him, the woman clutched the baby, her body trembling though her face was set. Through the shutter's crack, he watched as the riders slowed, their eyes sweeping the valley, their heads turning toward the thin ribbon of smoke curling from his chimney. The storm had passed. What came now was men. And they had found the trail. The riders cut black silhouettes against the pale ridge, their horses snorting white into the frozen air, steam rising like smoke from unseen fires. The cowboy stood at the narrow crack of the shutter, watching them descend in a slow, deliberate line. His face did not shift, but the stillness of his shoulders spoke of coiled readiness. Inside the cabin, the woman clutched the baby against her chest, her body rigid, her lips pressed hard to keep from trembling. She did not ask what would happen next. She already knew. The riders reached the open flat below, hooves crunching over crusted snow. They drew up before the cabin, 5 men broad in the saddle, rifles slung loose, pistols at their sides. Their leader, a man with a red scarf knotted around his neck and a beard gone silver at the edges, leaned forward in his saddle, his voice carrying sharp across the brittle air. "We come for what's ours," he called. "You've got no right to hide her." His eyes narrowed toward the shuttered window, his tone half taunting, half promise. "Hand over the Chinawoman and the brat, and maybe we let you keep the roof on your house." The cowboy stepped onto the porch, rifle resting calm in his hands. The cold wrapped him in silence, wind tugging his coat, snow hissing beneath his boots. His voice, when it came, was low but steady, a stone dropped into still water. "Ain't yours. Not now. Not ever." The men shifted in their saddles, uneasy with the lack of bluster, the weight behind his quiet. The leader spat into the snow, then grinned wide, showing broken teeth. "You think you can stand against us alone?" The cowboy's gaze flicked past them to the horizon, to the long sweep of land he had worked and bled for, to the cabin now holding the fragile lives entrusted to him. His grip tightened on the rifle. "Don't matter how many you bring," he said. "You won't take them." Inside, the woman pressed the baby close, her ears straining for every word. Fear clawed at her chest, but something else moved beneath it, an ache that was not terror but awe, raw and unfamiliar. She had been thrown aside, beaten, told she was nothing. Yet here was a man who staked his life on her survival without demand or bargain. She whispered against the child's soft hair, a prayer that had no words in any language she knew. The leader sneered, then lifted a hand. 2 men dismounted, stomping forward, rifles raised. Snow crunched under their boots, their shadows stretching toward the porch. The cowboy did not move. His rifle came up smooth, faster than breath. A crack split the air, echoing sharp across the valley. One man dropped hard, snow blooming red beneath him. The second froze, cursed, and scrambled for cover behind his horse. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders shouted, shots flaring like lightning in the white expanse. Bullets slammed against the cabin's walls, splintering wood. The woman crouched low, shielding the baby with her own body, heart pounding wild. Smoke stung her eyes, And still she held on, whispering the lullaby through clenched teeth to keep the child calm though her own fear roared. The cowboy fired again, methodical, each shot placed with deadly precision. A horse screamed, throwing its rider into the snow. Another man fell clutching his arm, blood painting the drift. The leader bellowed, rallying the last two, his voice cracking with rage. They surged forward, one circling wide to flank, the other charging straight at the porch. The cowboy dropped his empty rifle, drew his Colt, and fired into the rush. The bullet took the man in the chest, dropping him mid-stride. But the flanker reached the cabin side, smashing through the shutter with the butt of his gun. The woman screamed, clutching the baby as the barrel swung toward her. In that frozen second, she moved without thought. With one hand she shoved the baby beneath the thick quilt, with the other she seized the iron kettle from the hearth. Boiling water cascaded across the intruder's face. He howled, dropping his weapon, clawing at his burning skin. She struck again with the kettle, the clang of iron against bone sharp as a bell. He crumpled to the floorboards, writhing. The cowboy burst back through the door, his Colt raised, eyes scanning in an instant. The sight of her standing there, chest heaving, kettle in hand, froze him for a heartbeat. Then he finished it, one shot silencing the man's scream. Only the leader remained, red scarf whipping in the wind as he fired wildly from his saddle. The cowboy stepped onto the porch, each stride deliberate. Bullets tore splinters from the post beside him, hissed past his ear, but he kept walking, Colt steady. The leader's face twisted, bravado slipping into something close to fear. "You don't know what you've done," the man shouted, desperation roughening his voice. "She ain't worth dying for." The cowboy's voice was steady as winter itself. "Worth more than you'll ever be." He fired once. The leader reeled, slumped in his saddle, then slid into the snow, scarf darkening with his own blood. His horse bolted, disappearing into the white silence. The valley stilled. Smoke hung in the air, the acrid bite of powder mixing with the clean sting of frost. The cowboy stood among the fallen, his breath heavy, Colt lowered at last. Snowflakes drifted onto the bodies, already beginning to claim them. Inside, the woman rocked back onto the bed of hides, the baby crying sharp beneath the quilt. She pulled him close, her tears breaking free at last, falling hot against his skin. The lullaby returned to her lips, trembling but unbroken, as if it alone could keep the world from shattering. The cowboy stepped back in, snow crusted in his beard, blood smeared across his sleeve. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment neither spoke. He crossed the room, crouched beside her, and laid a hand over hers where it clutched the child. "From now," he said, voice low, each word carved deep, "he's ours. And you both got a home here." Her breath caught, a sob mingling with laughter, fragile and fierce. She pressed her forehead to his hand, the child cradled between them, their three shadows swaying together in the firelight. Outside, the storm began again, snow sweeping across the plains to bury the scars of violence. The cabin glowed warm against the night, its chimney smoke rising straight into the frozen sky. Inside, silence settled once more, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of belonging, of lives bound by choice, by survival, by a vow stronger than blood. The baby's cry softened, fading into the steady rhythm of breath. The woman leaned into the cowboy's shoulder, her body trembling still, but her eyes carrying something new. Not just relief, not just gratitude, but the first fragile seed of trust. He wrapped an arm around her, rough hands steady at her back, grounding her in the quiet that followed battle. The flames cracked, sparks lifting into the shadows. The night stretched long, but for the first time, it did not feel empty. They had faced death and claimed life instead. And though the wind clawed at the shutters, though the snow pressed hard against the walls, the cabin stood unshaken, a beacon against the dark. The cowboy's gaze lingered on the door, on the bodies already vanishing beneath white drifts. He knew this was not the last danger, not the last test. But he also knew the choice was made, the promise bound. Beside him, the woman shifted, her whisper barely audible above the fire. "We safe." He looked at her, then at the child sleeping against her chest. His voice was quiet, but certain. "We're home." The firelight caught their faces, etched in golden shadow, The final image holding still like the last frame of a reel. A man, a woman, and a child, fragile yet unbroken, seated against the storm, bound together by the kind of vow no winter could undo.